Hey, how's it going everyone? I'm White Pointer and welcome to the second video I'm doing to directly answer some questions from my comments about how classic games pulled off their graphical tricks. The response to the first one was really positive, and there were plenty more questions being left by viewers, so let's deep dive into even more games that have baffled gamers for the past few decades to solve the mysteries within them. Even if you didn't ask a question, maybe you've also wondered the same thing all this time. And as we go, why not try to guess what's happening before the answer is revealed? Let's do it! As before, we'll start with some Mega Drive games, and we might as well do the big one first. Road Rash by Electronic Arts. Sin 0100 and Bandapop, and I'm sure many of you as well, have been wondering how the scaling effects are being done in this game. Let's finally figure this out. So here we are, you all know what Road Rash looks like as we race down the road on our motorbike and break all the rules to try and finish first. There's a few different tricks being done here to achieve the end result, so let's break it down, starting way at the back with the solid background colour. If we turn off all the other planes, it reveals the background colour isn't just one colour, but two colours, one for the road and one for the sky. As the game is in motion, we can see it's not static. The point where both colours meet at the top is moving up and down, by updating the scan line where the colour changes every frame. This is what creates the hills and valleys in the road as you're racing along it. You might have noticed the sky colour again at the bottom of the screen. We'll get to that in a moment. Now let's take a look at planes A and B, and okay, these seem weird when we just look at the tile maps. Let's turn them on one by one to see how they're being translated into the game. Plane A, or what would normally be the foreground plane, is rendering the grass on the left side of the road, the snowy mountains in the far distance, and some of the clouds in the sky. Plane B, normally the background plane, is rendering the grass on the right side of the road, the closer green mountains, and some more clouds. Combined, they are forming the whole environment, with the two sets of mountains parallax scrolling independently as they are on separate planes, and the clouds actually doing even more parallax as they are also performing tile and line scrolling. There's also a bit of grass and mountains drawing at the bottom of the screen, because that's where the window layer is then added to display the HUD. The game needs the sky colour and the bits of the mountain so it can display these in the player's mirrors. So that's how the backgrounds work. Already that's a pretty clever and unique usage of the Mega Drive's hardware. But that's only half the story, isn't it? The other half is what's going on with those sprites, because they certainly look like they're scaling pretty smoothly, indicating they're not simply using fake scaling by swapping in different sizes, and indeed they aren't. In fact, if we try to isolate the sprite tiles, you'll see there really isn't any. The only sprite tiles are for the yellow lines on the road and the red lines for the speedometer. But all those other things, all the trees, road signs, houses, opponents, even the player, they are all clearly drawing to the sprite plane. Just what kind of programming wizardry is going on here? This completely baffled me. I was stumped. So I reached out to the man who would actually know what is happening, one of the original programmers, Dan Geisler, and awesomely he replied. He confirmed that the sprite scaling was his invention, and he created sprites on the fly to the correct scale dimensions of a 3D projection onto the main camera and the mirrors. Let me just reiterate that. The game is generating these sprites and scaling them in real time while the game is running. He went on to confirm that the artists created source images for him, and he wrote the code to generate the sprites in the game based off those images. There's no data for these sprite images actually stored in the game's ROM at all. It's all done in code. For those interested, he even elaborated a little bit on the algorithm he used. It was like a Bresenham line draw algorithm, but it always incremented one axis while occasionally skipping increment on the other axis where he would not draw a pixel from the source image. So he would skip drawing a column pixel instead of incrementing X, and the same ratio for skipping rows. I'll leave some links in the description to further resources about this if you want to read some more about it. Despite the impressive tech behind Road Rash, one downside is that it only runs at about 12 frames a second. So at this point, you might be coming to the same conclusion that I did. Oh, this must have been pretty CPU intensive. That explains the game's frame rate, right? Not so much, according to Dan. He revealed that the decision on the frame rate was actually up to the designers. He gave them the tools, but it was a conscious decision by them to cap it, and if they had more time, they would have tuned it to perform a bit better. That's a pretty long answer, but this question deserved one. Now we finally know, after all this time, how this game seemingly managed to achieve the impossible. A big thank you to Dan Geisler for taking the time to help me solve this puzzle. Now he can return to being a programming wizard. The Mega Drive was known to have some good shoot 'em ups, so let's tackle a couple of questions related to that genre. Renard Germinal asks, how was the scaling of the space station and ship done at the end of Thunder Force 3? Let's examine it. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be any level select codes for this game, which is how I normally test these kinds of things, but luckily it's only about a 30-minute playthrough, so it wasn't too bad to get to the end. So after you beat the final boss and the ending sequence starts, we see the enemy base zooming in towards the camera. Then the protagonist's ship is seen flying away from it, as it itself zooms in towards the camera, before the enemy base zooms back out into the distance and explodes. This whole sequence with the scaling going on looks quite similar to something the Super Nintendo could do with Mode 7, but the Mega Drive didn't have any hardware scaling. So what's going on here? Is this more software scaling magic? Well, no, not this time. But it's also not doing the same kind of thing we saw the Lawnmower Man doing in my previous video either. This is yet another different technique. To get an understanding of what's happening here, we'll need to examine the actual tiles that are making up this scene. It starts with nothing, then the space station appears by adding tiles, and as the space station is zooming in, we can see it gradually adding more tiles to the image to make it larger and larger. Don't get too confused by the weird layout the tiles are appearing in the debugger, that's just how they are stored in the console's memory. The space station is on plane B, or the background plane. Once that zoom in finishes, the player's ship appears on plane A, or the foreground plane, and scales larger the same way by gradually adding tiles. It then scrolls off the bottom of the screen, and the space station zooms out by reversing the process, gradually removing tiles until it disappears. It's really neat how developers came up with different ways to do this kind of stuff. The next question comes from Asundersoft. Could you explain the background in Round 5 of Wings of War / Gynoug for the Sega Genesis / Mega Drive? There seems to be so much going on, but I suspect it is similar to the technique used in Battlemania Daiginju. Sure, let's take a look. So here's the level in question, and whoa, dang, this is trippy. What even is this? Some kind of giant intestine or something? There looks like there's plenty going on here with the stage bending, swirling and morphing. It's almost overwhelming to the senses. So let's take a closer look at what the VDP is actually doing on each plane, as both planes are essentially doing the same thing, using a combination of vertical and horizontal scroll modes. To get a better grasp of what's going on, let's start by turning off these modes so we can see what the game would look like without them. As we can see, the game is scrolling the camera up and down on each plane as the level is scrolling left to right, but they are doing so at different speeds, with plane B moving up and down more rapidly than plane A. Now let's turn on vertical scrolling. This feature of the hardware is sometimes forgotten about, but as I explained in my video about how the Mega Drive's graphics worked, it didn't just have the capability to vertically scroll the whole plane, it could also vertically scroll a plane in smaller segments 2 tiles wide. When this is combined with regular horizontal scrolling, it can create a tilting effect. This is how games like Castlevania Bloodlines did the tilting tower, or Contra Hardcore did the big tilting boss in level 1. However, there's only so far you can do this before the image gets out of shape. In this case, doing this creates a warping effect. I'll leave a link to a video by Coding Secrets, made by former Mega Drive developer John Burton, if you want to know more about the technique. Now let's look at what the horizontal scrolling is doing. Both the tiles and lines are being scrolled at different rates as the scanline moves down the screen, constantly moving left and right, and manipulated in such a way that it creates a wave effect. You'll also note the waves in the foreground plane are larger than those in the background plane. With all of those scroll effects combined, we get the final effect we see in the game. Those designers must have been high on some pretty weird mushrooms when they created this level. Let's move on to the Super Nintendo with this question from Lit Jellyfish, and you'll see why I chose to transition with this one in particular in a moment. They ask, is the first boss in Contra 3 also using Mode 7 to rotate it? Or is that just several sprite columns to create the skews? Some of you might already know the answer to this, so let's see what's going on. So this is the fight with Slave Beast Taka, And what they are asking about is how the boss's body is warping around like that. It's actually not mode 7, but the boss's main body is still a background, so it's also not the other guess of it using sprites. The only part of it that's a sprite is the front leg. The game is performing a kind of unusual screen split on scanline 26, with the top portion where the HUD is using mode 1, and everything below it actually using mode 2. Why mode 2? Because this was one of the Super Nintendo's background modes that could use offset per tile. Vertical offset per tile specifically allowed the Super Nintendo to easily replicate the small segment vertical scrolling that we just saw the Mega Drive doing, and that's exactly what it's using here to warp the boss's body around. If we slow the game down, we can actually see this clearly without even needing debug tools. You can notice the individual columns of tiles that are being offset and scrolled up and down at different rates to create the tilting body. You might also notice something else kind of unusual. There's a cycle of the boss displaying normally for 5 frames, then having a mosaic effect being applied for 3 frames. I'm not 100% sure why it's doing this, but I assume it's to try and make the seams from the vertical offsets less obvious, and you barely notice it when the game is running at full speed. When the boss pounds the ground with its body, all the segments are moving up and down together at exactly the same time. Incidentally, vertical offset per tile is also how it's moving its head up and down. As you can see, the actual background tile map doesn't do this. The last remaining mystery is how Taka is extending its neck, because I'm sure you've noticed that the tile map isn't animated to do that either. The only thing it's animated to do is open and close its mouth. Maybe you knew about the body using vertical offsets, but hadn't given this effect much thought. Each neck segment is made up of 4 tiles stacked on top of each other, and they are using horizontal offset per tile to simultaneously extend the neck and push the head forward. Unlike vertical offset per tile, which could be controlled down to the pixel, horizontal offset per tile only allowed the columns to be shifted left or right by 8 pixels or 1 tile at a time. So it was used pretty rarely, as most of the time you want smoother movement from just scrolling the background normally. But as they only wanted the head to move here, and not the whole body, they just moved those columns of tiles that make up the head. And the restriction of only moving 1 tile width at a time works in this example, as the animation is fast, it only takes 12 frames to completely extend, and each neck segment is 1 tile wide. If you want to see what this fight looks like without any tile offsets being applied, well, here you go. Not quite as exciting, is it? It really shows you what could be done though. No need to take up extra room on the cartridge with animations, just get the hardware to do it. If you're enjoying this content and would like to see more of it, don't forget to subscribe so you know when I upload new videos. This question comes from Timtanium707. They want to know how the effect was created in Donkey Kong Country 3, where Kiddy and Dixie spin a rotating cylinder. Because, they say, it's clearly not just sliding a looping wooden texture plus text. The illusion of depth is present, and they have a hunch Mode 7 may be involved. Alright mate, let's unpeel this effect. So if you've played the game, you know exactly what this is referring to. This rotating cylinder, which for the intro sequence, also doubles as a kind of music box. It's a pretty neat effect, so how's it done? You might naturally assume that this is a kind of reverse of the famous spinning room from Super Castlevania 4, and it kind of is, but also kind of isn't. That room used Mode 7 and HDMI manipulation to make it look like you were inside a spinning room. The effect in Dixie Kong's Double Trouble also uses HDMI manipulation, but doesn't use Mode 7. This is using Mode 1. Layer 1 has the outside of the structure. Layer 2 looks like this, it's just a flat wood texture. Layer 3 has the text that rolls around with the cylinder. Layer 2 and 3 are basically doing the same thing here, they're simply scrolling from top to bottom and wrapping back up to the top, though the text on Layer 3 obviously updates when it's off the screen. The sense of depth is done with HDMI warping the scan lines that make up the cylinder and the text. Kind of the same technique that's used to create the peeling animation on the title screen of the first game. Clever use of the priority system, with the static structure at the front, gives the cylinder its rounded look on the sides. If we turn layer 1 off, it doesn't look quite so cylindrical. Dixie and Kiddy, the musical notes at the bottom and the pegs that hit them in the intro are all sprites, animated to sell the illusion of 3D. It's pretty interesting that despite the impressive visuals, which still look good even today, that take advantage of many of the SPPU's advanced features, Mode 7 isn't really ever utilised. The only times any of the original trilogy of DKC games ever use Mode 7 is to scale the Rareware logo when you first boot the game up, with the first two games shrinking it to the bottom right corner, and the third game blowing it up. Okay, it's time to tackle the Super Star Wars trilogy, and conveniently, there's been one question for each game, so let's run through them in chronological order. Chrono Triggered says that the Death Star trench run in Super Star Wars was always impressive to him and is wondering how it was done. Let's hop into our X-Wings and see if we can dismantle this. So the Death Star is the final level of the game, split into two sections. The first, you're dogfighting along the surface of the Death Star, and this is pretty typical Mode 7, nothing too unusual going on here. But the second section of the level reenacts the famous scene from the movie, as you, playing as Luke Skywalker, pilot your X-Wing along the trench, and this is actually a pretty unique fake 3D effect. This is not Mode 7, so what do you think? Have a guess and then continue to see if you are right. What the game's doing here is actually using the seriously underutilized Mode 0 background mode, giving it a total of 4 background layers to work with. Working from the back to the front, Layer 4 contains the floor of the trench and the stars in the sky, and Layer 3 contains the sides. Both of these are animated to create the sense of movement. The interior of the X-Wing, that also contains the HUD, is on Layer 2. That's pretty much everything though, right? Surely everything else is sprites? Well, almost everything. I'm not entirely sure why they did this, but when you shoot your weapons, the green blaster projectile is actually on background Layer 1. Yeah, weird. So there you go, that's how the Death Star trench run was built. Pretty simple in the end, but that doesn't make it any less effective. Moving on to Super Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back, Webhead123 has always wondered how they achieved the effect in the Cloud City flying stage, where you can pass the X-Wing above and below the cloud layer. Let's see what's going on with this. So here we are, flying the X-Wing again as we make our way to the game's climax against Darth Vader. The first thing to note is the undulating height on the Mode 7 cloud layer. This is the same technique used earlier in the game during the Hoth level, and something I've previously covered. But the question is about this. In what is a pretty unique implementation of Mode 7, you can actually fly through the Mode 7 layer and pop out underneath it. That's certainly interesting. How is the game doing that? There's actually two screen splits going on here. The top portion with the HUD is displaying in Mode 1. Then there's a split on scanline 33, and the game from there is displaying in Mode 2. Huh, interesting. I actually don't know why they chose to use Mode 2 in this case, because offset per tile isn't being used here. Then the screen splits again, roughly around scanline 125, though as we noted this can vary as you play the level. So what's happening when the player flies under the clouds? Is it simply reversing the order of the mode in each segment? Well, no, it's not. Look at what happens to the HUD at the top of the screen when you go below the clouds. It actually disappears. In fact, there's no Mode 1 screen segment down here at all. The top portion is Mode 7, and the bottom portion is Mode 2. But it's not simply swapping the Mode 2 and Mode 7 segments around, because they look different. The full Mode 2 tile map looks like this, so without the Mode 7 clouds there, this is all you would see. But the Mode 7 portion is also different, looking at the underside. When the player passes over the scan line where the split is occurring, it's actually using the Super Nintendo's built-in Mode 7 mirroring feature. Remember how I explained this in my Mode 7 video? In those examples, such as Hyperzone, two segments were using Mode 7, with one of them being mirrored. But you didn't need to necessarily have two Mode 7 segments visible on the screen. It still worked with just one. What's happening here is the game is turning the mirrored mode on and off as the player passes over the scanline split point. You can see it hitting the register that controls the Mode 7 vertical mirroring. It's still performing the same affine transformations, it's just reflected due to the mirrored effect. I can't really think of any other games that make use of the Mode 7 mirroring feature quite like this, though I'm sure there are some out there. To finish off the trilogy, Stratalia and Edward Perkins 1225 both had the same question about Super Star Wars Return of the Jedi. They want to know how the effect was made for the final 2 levels of the game, where you need to enter and then escape from the new Death Star in the Millennium Falcon. There seems to be some kind of multi-layer or infinite zoom effect going on, which shouldn't be possible with Mode 7. Let's see if the Force can help us solve this. Anyway, here we are inside the cockpit of the Millennium Falcon, flying through the tunnels of the second Death Star, and yeah, you can see what they're talking about. It looks like there's some actual depth to the tunnel, and you're constantly flying into the screen. But Mode 7 is just a single flat tile map, and it's only so far you can zoom in on it. So how the heck did the developers, Sculptured Software, make the Super Nintendo do this? First things first, let's take a look at the Mode 7 tile map. The image of the tile map is already set up like a 2-point perspective drawing, looking like it's a long tunnel. Mode 7 is used to zoom in on this image and rotate it, and zooms in up to a certain point before it resets back to its starting position to go again. That would be pretty jerky and abrupt if that's all it was doing, so check out what happens at the same time as the zoom. The outer part of the image darkens until it fades out, while the center of the image brightens to reveal the tunnel extends a little bit further. This makes it look like the next segment of the tunnel is coming at you out of the shadows as you fly through. This change of brightness constantly cycles and coincides with when the Mode 7 zoom resets back. The zoom level is at its minimum when the edges of the image are completely visible and the center is invisible, and reaches its maximum when the edges of the image are invisible and the center is completely visible. It then resets back to the minimum zoom level to repeat the loop. The end result looks like a completely seamless long tunnel. That's already a really inventive implementation of Mode 7, but that's not quite the end of it. As you fly down the shaft, which I must say takes a lot longer than I remember it took them in the movie, the environment changes, but again, this looks like a pretty seamless transition. If they were replacing the tile map on the fly, you'd see one end and the next start pretty abruptly. Well, what I've been showing you so far isn't the whole tile map, it's only the part that the player sees. It's actually bigger than this, and it contains another similar looking image that is not part of the player's vision, but it still seems to be matching the brightness changes we've discovered. What's it there for? Well, as you approach the point where an environment transition is about to happen, the player's view briefly swaps to this image for one zoom cycle, before moving back to the original image. It might swap between the 2 images a couple of times as you move from one environment to the next, and this covers up when the Mode 7 tile map changes to make it happen more organically.
Everybody got that? Good!
All of the Super Star Wars games were really innovative with their graphical effects and Mode 7 use in general, and this is a very fitting and fantastic end to the trilogy. So there it is, more mysteries solved. I hope this has been helpful, not just to those of you who asked the questions, but anyone else watching that may have also been pondering these same things. It's always impressive to me how developers manage to really push the limits of these older systems in all kinds of different ways. There were some really clever tricks explored in this video. Which did you like the most? Let me know in the comments. Don't worry if I didn't get to your question in this video, as there's more of these on the way, so be on the lookout for the next one and keep the questions coming. Give me a thumbs up if you liked this video, it really helps a lot, and don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with my content. Thanks for watching and see you next time.